truth and imperfect living.
Hey, greetings, folks. I'm Greg Willits from RosaryArmy.com.
And I'm Jennifer Willits, his wife.
Hey, you didn't know this, but we are preeminent scientists, and we know all about physics and biology and what are some other sciences? Chemistry.
Yeah, one of those pictures behind us is actually our degree, in physics and stuff.
We know
We're doctors.
all about this stuff. And you're going to see just how intelligent we are when we go head-to-head with Dr. Brian Miller. He's one of the contributors to this brand new book called God's Grandeur, The Catholic Case for Intelligent Design. And in case you can't detect the snark, we are obviously being very snarky in that we are not scientists at all, but we are someone who is constantly in search for truth and constantly trying to understand and have a deeper understanding of our relationship with God, our creator, who did indeed have intelligent design in mind when he created us and when he created the world. And so that's why we really wanted to take a risk and dive into an area that we're a little uncomfortable with, which is science, right? That we aren't the preeminent folks who you would expect to present scientific concepts to, but we hope that you will see through some of the questions that we ask and have a greater understanding through these questions that we ask of Dr. Brian Miller. He is one of the senior fellows over at the Discovery Institute. We'll share all sorts of links throughout the course of this, but discovery.org and intelligentdesign.org. As we dive into this book, it's called God's Grandeur, The Catholic Case for Intelligent Design. Brian, it's always kind of fascinating when we talk to someone who is in what would be considered the atypical field of discussing Catholicism. You're a scientist as well, and you are a part of something called the Discovery Institute. What is the Discovery Institute, and what does this have to do with our faith?
Well, the Discovery Institute is a think tank that talks about a lot of different topics, things like education, transportation, homelessness. But one of the main topics they address is the issue of science. So we are considered one of the major centers of what's called the intelligent design research community. And we are a group of scholars who talk about the evidence of design in nature. That includes everything from our universe to our planet to life. And we talk about why believing in design is both important for advancing science and in helping to promote a flourishing society.
So the idea of intelligent design, right away, I feel like we need to kind of Let's pull out our glossary and figure out what vernacular are we going to be using during the course of this conversation. What is exactly intelligent design? When we throw that out there, I can take a guess of what it might be, and someone else listening might have their different definition. When you talk about intelligent design, and that's one of your websites, intelligentdesign.org, what does that mean? And what is it that you want people to think of when they think of intelligent design?
That's an excellent question. In fact, I think it's helpful if we just take a step back in history. Because if you go all the way back to the ancient Greeks, about 500 BC, the philosophers were debating that if we look at the world around us, is everything we see simply a product of chance, time, and natural processes? Or when we look at the world, do we see evidence of a mind? When we see the order in life, the order of our planet, is that something that's just an accident, or was it something that was intentional? And that debate has continued on for 2.5 millennia. And we are sort of modern proponents of this idea that when you look at the world, it doesn't look like just chance and time. It looks like that it was planned. So when you look at the laws of nature, they don't look like they were just random laws, but the laws of nature look like they were specifically designed for the purpose of supporting life. When you look at our planet doesn't look like just an accident. It looks like so many details were designed for life for a purpose, and that was not a coincidence. And when you look at life, you see the evidence of a mind that planned out the architecture of an organism. It's not something that just happened because of chance events in the past.
You know, this explanation is so sound and reasonable. It's hard for me to wrap my brain around the fact that anyone would have an issue with it. Why would anybody fight what seems like sounds logic to me? And yet there is a great number of people, even in the Catholic community, he might not even agree with what you just said. And that kind of blows my mind. So why do you think people take issue with what you said?
Well, again, it's important to realize that this is a debate that's gone on for 2.5 millennia. And what took place is at the time of Jesus, when Paul wrote Romans 1, for instance, there were many people that believed both sides of the debate. Many people thought that life was the product of design. Others believed that life was just chance and time. And when Paul talked about in Romans 1 how you see evidence of a creator in nature, he was taking the side of those who believed in the mind. And what happened is during the time that the church rose, the pendulum swung all the way over to the side of design. Very few people believed it was just chance and natural processes. But what you have is with the quote unquote Enlightenment, with the rise of modern science, with secular philosophies taking more and more, becoming more dominant in Western culture, what took place is that at the philosophical level, people wanted to deny God's existence in the world and to explain everything in terms of chance, time, and natural processes. So obviously, when Darwin's theory of evolution came on, it was very well received by many who saw that as the creation narrative of the world, not just of life, but also of the origin of life and even of our planet and even of universes today. And what took place is that influence grew stronger and stronger in the West until even many people who were religious, people that were Catholic theologians or Catholic philosophers, felt the pressure that they had to rethink faith in such a way that it would conform to these philosophical trends. So now what's happened is many Christians have said that if we want to look respectable, we have to embrace the idea that everything we see in the world is a product of natural processes. Yet we can sort of still have faith in a sort of a vague sense that God was somehow behind it, but it just looks like we're here by chance. So a lot of it in the West is those pressures from the academic realm.
And that's what's so weird about it. It's almost like if you were to go down certain scientific avenues, those particular avenues, like certain views of evolution, those seem more chance-based. Those seem more harder to actually imagine than that of intelligent design. And it kind of boggles my mind, as you said a moment ago. We know people that will just say, well, it was all happenstance. Happenstance is an easier thing for them to swallow than the idea of everything was done intentionally. In some of what you just described, Brian, is there, in the Catholic realm, the idea of evolution? You mentioned Darwin and that idea, and I think about the people that stick the Darwin fish bumper sticker on their cars, kind of in a way of mocking Christianity. They're taking the Jesus fish and turning it into a fish with a couple of feet on it. With evolution, is evolution somehow, does it exclude religion, or is that something also that we as Catholics can find some validity in? Did we evolve in the way that Darwin was saying that we evolved?
That's, again, a very important question. And it's helpful also, I want to go back in history again, just to help give context, because in the early church, there was the challenge of people like the materialists that I talked about, the people that are saying everything was chance and time. But there's also another group of Christians called the Gnostics. And the Gnostics believed that God wasn't the direct creator, but he created what was called the demiurge, and then the demiurge directly created what we see in the world, so that God wasn't responsible for a lot of the problems in the world because he didn't directly create it. And what's interesting is if you look at the modern form of what's called theistic evolution or evolutionary creationism, it has a lot of the same feel of that Gnostic view of creation. So in principle, you could say that God designed the world in such a way that it could evolve. And there's certain truth to that. That's obviously the case, that God designed natural laws so that we have seasons and we go around the sun because of natural processes like gravity. But what happens is the idea is that God created evolution, but then he kind of let it do its thing. And what happened is a lot of what we see in nature is not what God directly intended, but it's things that he didn't intend. So if you read a lot of theistic evolutionists, including Catholic theistic evolutionists, in fact, let me quote from one who wrote a very prominent book called Finding Darwin's God. He said that if you rewound the tape of history, we would end up completely different. That he describes humans as a happenstance, an accident, And then God just kind of let evolution do its thing, and he saw something interesting, and then he started to develop a relationship with us. That's the idea. Another prominent book talking about God and evolution by a very prominent individual talks about that Christians should not believe in design because the human body looks so badly designed. There's so much junk DNA. We've got our eyes are wired backwards. So again, it's the same thing, that God is not the direct creator of us, but is sort of a secondary creator, and things happened in ways he didn't intend. And that is very much not consistent with Catholic theology. I think it was Pope Benedict that talked about we're not an accident, we're not a happenstance, but we're loved and we're intended by God. So in principle, you could have ideas of evolution that are consistent, that maybe God directed it or God somehow set everything up. But the form of evolution promoted by Darwin and promoted by virtually all experts in the field is a version that is inconsistent with Catholic theology because it says we are to a large extent unintended accidents.
You know, when I talk to someone like you, and you have a PhD in physics, and you've spent your entire career focusing on these things, and then you have someone like me who I kind of remember high school biology. You know, I feel very inadequate to even start diving into these topics. And I imagine that some people listening to us right now, you know, they think about trying to pick up a book like this God's Grandeur that you had a part to do with, The Catholic Case for Intelligent Design. It shouldn't be as unapproachable as I think that sometimes we make it in our minds. How do you recommend for someone who science isn't their preeminent thing that they're always thinking about? How can they start to look at this and understand this from a scientific perspective and be able to think about it, to think about intelligent design intelligently? How can we begin to understand this if science is not something that we're spending a lot of time with in our own lives?
Well, the beauty of it is that the evidence of design is accessible to all of us. In fact, Paul talks about this in Romans 1, that he even goes so far as to say that if you don't recognize God's hand in nature, you are actively suppressing the truth. So all you have to do, and it doesn't matter if you have a PhD in biology or if you're a child, look at a video that describes metamorphosis. Look at the structure of the human eye and how vision works. Talk to a chiropractor and ask them how well he thinks our spine is designed and why. He or she could go on for an hour of how exquisitely and optimally designed all of our bones and nerves are so that we could function at such a high level. So that's the irony, is that it's very accessible to everyone. Now, this is what's really key. What you find with Charles Darwin is he read Christians who talked about design and nature and found them very convincing. But what he did was he would use their language, he would use their examples, but he said natural selection is the actual creator. So the idea is that nature just selects for this, and it selects for that. And it's nature that creates everything in rather extraordinary ways. So it was sort of a bait and switch. That everyone knows life looks designed, but he said the designer is not God, but it's sort of this blind, undirected process. Well, if you think that's reasonable, then I just would encourage any of our listeners to go to a computer program, randomly change letters, and see how many of those random changes improves the computer program and how many of those random changes debilitates the computer program. And then it should be very clear to them.
Okay, one comment about this thought process that, like, the other people, the people who just believe that, like as Darwin espoused, that God is not actually the creator. You know, the people who just believe in chance, they have to be basing that on evidence. It sounds like their evidence is simply their refusal to believe in God. So therefore, they've got evidence that supports their point of view. But in your think tank, you obviously have to know both sides very well in order to get the truth out there. So what is the platform that they are clinging to so desperately to sort of further their agenda? What is their evidence?
Well, what happens is if you look, have you ever seen one of those pictures of an old woman or a young girl? It depends on your vantage point.
Yeah, with the sort of like a silhouette type thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what happens is when you look at the world through a certain set of assumptions, then you will fit the data to those assumptions. And here is the primary, there's a couple of primary arguments. One argument is that we do see change in nature. So you can crossbreed dogs, and what do you see? You can get small dogs, you can get large dogs. You can crossbreed sheep, and what do you get? You can get sheep that have more wool with time. This is what Darwin saw. These are the examples he used. So then you could say, well, if we see these small changes happening in a relatively short period of time, maybe a matter of years, couldn't that same process of change happen over millions of years to get very big changes? So that's the first argument. It's simply saying the small changes can accumulate and get bigger and bigger changes. And now let me just kind of talk about the problem with that argument.
Yeah.
The problem with that argument is that it's based on that assumption, which we now know to be false. If you crossbreed animals, there's always a limit. There's always a wall that it hits, and it can no longer change that much. And the more that people study the extent to which animals or plants can change, the more they realize that those changes aren't even through random mutations, but organisms are programmed to be sensing the environment. And then when they sense a particular condition, they change themselves through internally designed mechanisms to adapt to those environments. Like a fish might grow more spines, or it might get larger, or it might have lighter colored scales. That's a revolution taking place now. What they're also finding out is that the mutations, the changes in DNA aren't random, but there's what's called natural genetic engineering. So they're finding more and more that these genetic alterations are not random, but they seem to be controlled by a program. So dogs, for instance, I mentioned dogs. If you look at the genetic variation in dogs that produces these amazing variations, it's not random, but they're what are called, and I won't get into the technical details too much, but if you'll just allow me, tandem repeats, they use these terms. But what happens is these genetic changes happen 1,000 times more often than random mutations. So it seems that these organisms are programmed to change in certain ways to help them, but the changes are always highly, highly constrained. So the first assumption we now know to be false. The next assumption is that similarity implies common ancestry. So you look at all mammals, and all mammals have certain common features. They have, a lot of them have this sort of pendactyl hand. We have like 5 fingers or digits and certain bones, and they see these similarities and they say, aha, those similarities are due to the fact that they all evolved from a common ancestor. So that common ancestor had the first mammal-like features, like it could produce milk, and that carried along in this evolutionary tree in all the branches. So when you assume similarity implies common ancestry, that there is an ancestor, that is very, very powerful evidence for evolution if you accept the assumption. But here again, as scientists have looked at the similarities, they don't fit into a tree-like pattern. So for instance, if you have an evolutionary tree and you have 2 branches that are far apart, you'd expect everything about these creatures to be very, very different. An elephant and a whale should be very different. While creatures that are very close on these branches, like a mouse and a rat, should be very similar in every ways. That's not the case. You've got similarities, striking similarities in creatures that are very different from each other. Like humans and octopi have very similar camera-like eyes. And that can't be explained because we have a common ancestor. And yet things that are very similar might be very, very different. So the assumption that similarity implies common ancestry is very powerful, but now we know it to be false. Because there's so many contradictions, it looks more like an engineer. Why is it that a car and a motorcycle have so many similarities? It's not because they evolved from a common ancestor. It's because engineers use the same engineering principles. So here again, the framework of design explains the data much better than an evolutionary framework. But if you assume evolution must be true because everything must be the product of natural processes, then you're willing to overlook all of the inconsistencies and come up with sort of patchwork sub-theories to plug the holes.
One of the things I keep thinking about, Brian, as you're talking is what it must have been like for you getting your education and going through an educational system where so many of the things that you're defending against right now were being probably pushed at you, and I'm making an assumption. I'm sure that you had to have had sort of like this dual education happening for you, where you're learning the stuff that you actually want to learn scientifically, but you're also having to learn how to defend. I'm making an assumption here. Tell us a little bit about your own faith background and why it became important for you to start finding ways of bringing your faith and science together in your own life and in your work.
Well, what happened was I was raised Catholic, and I went to MIT undergraduate and was studying physics with engineering. And I read Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker. He argues that, again, the appearance of design in nature is an illusion. Everything is just chance and time. I then had many other challenges to my faith. So I became very convinced that Christians were simply people that didn't think too carefully. They were more emotionally driven, that the really smart people that were science oriented knew that there probably wasn't a God. And I realized that that was very discouraging, because if there was no God and I was just an accident in nature, I will die. So it doesn't matter if I'm happy or sad or kind or cruel. All my memories will be lost, our sun will explode, and all life will be extinct. Now, that was very dark thoughts for freshmen in college, but that's where I was.
Everything goes to the death.
So I said, God, I don't know if you exist, but if you exist, you have to prove it to me, because I'm a scientist. I just can't believe this blindly. And I said, if you do prove it to me, then I will serve you with all of my heart for all my life, regardless of the cost. And what happened is God put me on a journey. He divinely connected me with leading scientists and theologians and Bible scholars who helped bring me back to faith. And what I became, I've been spending, over 30 years, like 35 years on this journey, studying everything I could study, from biology to physics to chemistry to many other disciplines. And what's become very clear is that a little science can take a person away from God, but a lot of science can bring them back.
Yeah, I wondered that. Doesn't science actually affirm God? The deeper you go, the more God you see?
Yes, absolutely the case. In fact, what's interesting is if you look at the early pioneers of modern science, people like Newton, people like Galileo, people like Kepler, what you consistently find is that people of science who founded the major disciplines were people of deep faith, because it was their faith that drove them to do science. Because if you believe in a creator, and you believe that creator created us in his image, you will believe that the world is orderly and that we have the ability from our creator to understand that order. In fact, you look at Genesis, the language of go out and be fruitful and multiply and go into the earth is really a language of science. It's a language of technology. It's a language of understanding the world around us. So it was the faith of the Christians that allowed them to do science. Because if you believe we're just here as an accident, that our brains are accidents of nature, why would you think that our brain would accidentally have the capacity to understand quantum mechanics or general relativity? Or at least if you're a physicist.
I was about to say, some of us might be able to understand that, but not all of us. One of the questions that I am thinking about, and I saw this in the book, and I don't remember if it was from the chapters that you wrote in God's Grandeur, but the idea that the acceptance of God's design, of intelligent design, is actually on the upswing in scientific communities. Did I read that right? Is that something that you're seeing? Are more and more scientists saying that this is not all accidental, that this is something that is at the hands of a creator?
Yeah, you are seeing this. And then I helped to write a book. I was sort of the main technical consultant behind the book, also Return of the God Hypothesis, which deals with the history in more depth. And what you're finding is cosmologists, people that study where our universe came from and the laws of physics, are being forced to conclude that it looks like there's a mind behind our universe. I think Alan Standage might be one I'm thinking of, who is a physicist. He said when he looks at things like the laws of nature, the fact they seem to be designed for the purpose of supporting life. When you look at our universe, it had a beginning. I mean, that's very, Genesis. Like in the beginning, God said, let there be light. And what do we see? Our universe begins in an explosion of energy, an expansion of space. That what you're seeing is that the science of physics is screaming out that there's a mind behind our universe. Now, the strongest resistance is obviously biology, because the Darwinian narrative, or what you might call modern neo-Darwinism or the modern synthesis, is the creation narrative of secular society. It's the creation narrative that forms the foundation of a philosophy that says we are all that is. Nature is all that there is. So there's enormous resistance to question it. But even there, what you're finding is that more and more engineers are starting to work with biologists. And the more they do, they realize that life doesn't look like some accident where different things just kind of came together by chance, but it looks like a mind planned everything in advance, we see the same engineering principles that we use in life, like negative feedback loops, four-bar linkages. We see levels of optimization. People used to think that if it's just an accident, life should be suboptimal, poorly designed. There should be lots of quote unquote junk DNA that doesn't work. And that's what people believed decades ago. But now they're realizing that life looks optimally designed, perfectly designed. And what people used to think was junk DNA or poor design, they now know is functional.
How do you reconcile some of the biblical narrative of creation with what we know in terms of science? When we look at things like, the world was created in 6 days. Is there room for the Big Bang Theory in there? Is there room for evolution in there? What about in regards to looking at the early creation stories in Genesis and seeing, Noah lived until he was 900 years old, or whatever, those things that in modern day reading seem like scientific
fantasy.
Well, not fantasy maybe, but they don't coincide to the reality that we know of in science. How do we reconcile those types of discrepancies from when we read the narratives in Scripture with what science actually tells us?
Yeah, that's a challenge many Christians have. And I certainly can't claim I can answer all the questions or dot all the I's and cross all the T's. I'm more of a person that asks, where is the overarching evidence pointing? What narrative fits everything the best? So there are many Christians, very thoughtful Christians, who believe that the best way to understand Genesis is 6 literal creation days in 24 hours, about 6,000 years ago, and they attempt to reconcile modern science with that claim. And they recognize they haven't done a full job of it yet. They're still trying, and I respect that. I fully respect that. Other Christians like myself feel that if you look at the literary context, you look at the purpose of the authors, you look at the genre, the literary genre, it's acceptable to interpret the days of Genesis as not necessarily being a literal 24-hour days to literally explain what happened along those lines, but it's presenting the overarching principles of creation, this idea that God is the creator, this idea that life is a product of his mind, this idea that the seasons were designed to have certain rhythms for our purpose, the idea that we're created in his image, all of that is perfectly consistent with science. And then the secondary issues that Christians debate about, we can respect each other's opinions, we can recognize there still may be tensions, but the tensions are really small compared to the massive tensions of denying that science points to a mind, denying the historical evidences of resurrection, denying the miraculous power of people that pray in Jesus' name. So yes, there's still tensions, there's still uncertainties, there's still debates that people have, which is fine, we can wrestle with that. But the big picture is a picture that points to a creator, and specifically as Jesus Christ, as God in the flesh that died for our sins. So that's comfort I have, even if all the answers aren't out there yet.
So when we're looking at the book, God's Grandeur, the Catholic Case for Intelligent Design, and there's all sorts of authors who have contributed to this, some of whom have been guests on the program in the past. You broke it down into, you have sections on science, sections on philosophy, sections on theology. Give us a sense of it, because it has different authors. There's not necessarily a grand narrative as much as there is a thematic. What's the ultimate thematic conclusion that you're trying to help people go to in regards to understanding God's design in the world and in science?
Yeah, and there's really 3 points. One is that science points to design in every area, whether it be biology, planetary studies, or the universe. That design, the evidence of design is clear. 2, that is completely consistent with Scripture. If you read Romans, the historical cultural context of Romans was the same design debate. You had the materialists and the evolutionists on one side that Paul critiqued, and the proponents of design that Paul affirmed. And then it's also consistent with Catholic teaching from the very beginning. If you read, you could talk about the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John, in the beginning, he says all things are created through and for Christ. Well, Irenaeus, in Against Heresy, said part of the reason that he wrote that was to challenge the Gnostic belief that there was a secondary creator that God didn't directly control, which again is what people believe today. We're trying to reconcile like Darwinian evolution with Catholic theology. You look at Athanasius, same thing. Athanasius felt that the theology of the church rested upon the idea that God is our direct creator. So that's the other point, is that historic Catholic theology has always been consistent with its belief in design. The challenge is that because so many scientists with the money and the power have told theologians and philosophers and priests that you must reconcile Catholicism with evolution and scientific materialism, or else we'll look silly. So they felt under obligation to reinterpret scripture, reinterpret church tradition, reinterpret theology. And one of the most extraordinary examples is Thomas Aquinas, because people say that Thomas Aquinas is more consistent with evolution than with design. And if you read Thomas Aquinas, it's obviously that that's not the case. Thomas believed that only God could create the essence of an animal or plant, that God had to create each what you might call as distinctive type of organism. And it could change somewhat, like a mule, but it couldn't change significantly. And Thomas Aquinas compared life to human artifacts. So he's making this analogy between human structures and life to point to a creator. So many Thomists have been told you must make Thomism reconcile with evolution. So they interpret Thomas in ways that he would not approve. That's the challenge.
Yeah, and the idea of trying to take, when you talked about structures and that kind of thing, could you talk about that a little bit more? Because you threw it out there, my brain started to fold around it, getting it, and then we moved on for a second. When you say that there's a correlation between, I guess, evolution, intelligent design, things changing that way with the structure of buildings, or you used the analogy of a car and a motorcycle earlier, I find that a really interesting thing that I'm trying to wrestle with as you're talking, right? I'm trying to grasp it while we're moving on with the other things at the same time. Could you talk a little bit more about that, those kind of analogies? Because I think that there's something in there that someone like me, who's not a scientific base, but definitely lives in the world and sees how, there's commonalities. Like, I'm an artist, and so I tend to look at structures of cubes and how everything has shapes, and someone's arm is more formed like a cylinder. Then I find that very interesting, that there are these common engineering concepts that I hear you talking about throughout the course of that I haven't really thought about in the way that you're explaining it. I'd love to hear more on that.
You have just you just asked me about my absolute favorite topic. Because I am leading a team of engineers and biologists that are applying engineering principles to biology. And we're in the process of publishing papers. And the insights that people are having, the understanding of life at a much deeper level we are on the forefront of the next great scientific revolution. In fact, if you look at people in systems biology, they use that language. They talk about the shift from what's called reductionism, where everything is explained by natural chemical reactions, to holism, which is this idea that it looks more like a blueprint. So this is really, we're at just the earliest stages of this revolution. But let me use some simple analogies to help you really appreciate it. The idea of evolution is that everything is happening by chance. So imagine you have these different pieces, or they could be organs, they could be proteins, whatever. The idea is that they kind of move around through random mutations, and eventually they come together to form something that may do something new. And it's like a Rube Goldberg machine. Now, if you're familiar with the Rube Goldberg machine, it's like someone wants to create a device to wipe their chin with a napkin. So they take a parrot with a cracker, they tie it to a rope with a piece of string with a fire. There's a little rocket that then goes and does something else. So it's sort of this really ridiculously complex, artificially constructed machine where each part was not designed to work with the other parts.
You just described how we do our show each week, by the way.
It's stop it.
Okay, that's great. I have to listen more. So what happens is that's what life should look like. If you look at any complex system, it should look somewhat clumsy, suboptimal. There should be pieces that kind of fit, but not really. And a lot really shouldn't work all that well, because you've got to have a lot of trial and errors. So our body should be filled with failed experiments. That's the basic idea.
Yeah.
And there's actually mathematical analyses that demonstrate that must be the case. But that's the exact opposite of top-down design. If you're going to design a car, you're going to think about the overarching purpose of the car. You think from the top level of organization. You want to have a chassis. You want to have an engine. You want to have a passenger compartment. You want to have some sort of gear shift system. So you think top down. You think of the highest level organization, and then you design everything with everything else in mind so that everything fits properly. There's interfaces where one machine can let's say pass fuel from the gas tank to the engine. You have coordination. That's top-down design. That's what life looks like. Life looks like a mind designed everything with a goal in mind. So let's talk about hearing, for instance. In fact, there's a beautiful book I'd recommend to you and the listeners. It's called Your Design Body. It's Your Design Body by Steve Laufman and Howard Glicksman. And Steve Laufman is a systems engineer, and Howard Glicksman is a physician in hospice. And you look at things like hearing. What happens in hearing is you have your eardrum that vibrates with sound, and the sound wave from the air has to go to what's called the cochlea, which is this tube filled with a liquid. And when the vibrations hit the fluid, the vibrations go through the fluid, and love this. There's a membrane that has a different width because different parts of the membrane vibrate with different frequencies. And there's different little hair cells at every part of the membrane that separate those frequencies into separate neural connections. That's how you separate sound frequencies, just like an engineer would do it. But then it's hard to go from air to water because the resistance of sound through air is different than through a liquid. So what you have is three bones that form a double hinge. They're called ossicles. And I encourage your listeners to do a video on ossicles. So it's sort of a double hinge. And what happens is the lever arm and the areas are perfectly designed to match what's called the impedance. So all the energy from the air goes into the fluid. Now, if you're a systems engineer, you have to plan that in advance. You have to know what you're doing in advance to put everything in the right place. But there's another thing if you're an engineer. So if you're designing a car and you have your accelerator and suddenly you're driving and you come across, a nice elderly lady pushing, let's say, a carriage across the street, what do you need in your car?
Brakes.
Brakes.
A way to stop.
What happens if you don't have brakes?
There's going to be a terrible tragedy. You have to think ahead that there will be a need to stop.
In the same way, what would happen, because we hear sounds over an enormous range, an absolutely enormous range. So you have to have very, very sensitive machinery to detect soft sounds, but that machinery would be damaged by loud sounds. So there's specialized muscles that attach to those little bones in your ear. So there's a feedback loop. So if you hear something too loud, a signal, there's sort of a computational mechanism that says, uh-oh, the sound's too large. Send the signal to those muscles. They contract and they prevent the sound from going into the cochlea. So there's risk management, just like any engineer would do. So we have systems engineers looking at biological systems, and it's like they can read the mind of God. Because the same planning, the same concerns, the same principles, the same patterns they use are used in life, except it's done at a much better level with life.
It's like there's a tendency towards the order of stability. Things want to be in a state of homeostasis. I remember that from biology class years ago. And even when I've taught my children how to drive a car, and it's like, listen, if you release your hands off the steering wheel, notice what the car will do. It kind of just wants to go straight. It doesn't want to go all over the place. You have to make it change and deviate from its course, but it wants to move in a particular way. Observe that, notice that, cooperate with it, And so I see our bodies even have a tendency toward a normal, a baseline way of living that it's perceived its normal state, that it's always wanting to get to. I've even, had the great pleasure of just observing loved ones who are near death and to watch how they cling to life and how there's this powerful, supernatural, they don't want to die. They hold on to it. And it kind of defies logic, but this is all the design. It's I think part of that system that it's that risk management is looking toward, it's wanting to hold on to for the last possible moment. But why? Those are the big questions. Why does it happen this way? What is God telling us by these set of circumstances? And what can we learn? And how can we grow in our faith because of it? It's It's all very, very fascinating stuff indeed. And I'm thinking, with all your knowledge of hearing, can't you figure out the problem of tinnitus? Can't you solve that, please, for all of us, so that it will just be gone? Like, how could it be that we are plagued with this for the rest of our lives?
That'll be covered in the sequel, God's jokes, the practical jokes from God.
Well, just a second. Let me put that on my to-do list.
Yeah.
Tinnitus,
Solve
cancer.
tinnitus.
Yeah, got it. Okay, next Tuesday, I'll send you back the solution.
Yeah,
Thank
that'll
you.
be
That'd be
fantastic. So if people want to know more about not only intelligent design, they go to the website discoveryinstitute.org. What kind of information are they going to find on that website?
Right. So if you go to discovery.org, you'll want to go to intelligent design, and then you can sign up for our a kind of a weekly update list. Nota bene, that's one option. You'll learn about our conferences. You'll learn about different resources. If you go to intelligentdesign.org, that is sort of an entryway where you can learn about the evidence, the concepts, the philosophical framework at different levels. So there's some things for introductory, things for more advanced. And the one thing you'll definitely want to watch are the videos. Because when you look at videos of the molecular machines in life, if you buy, let's say, DVDs on things like metamorphosis, you won't need a PhD in biology. You won't need a degree in philosophy. It'll be self-evident to you that we are designed, and that's significant. So that's a great way that's sort of a nice next step.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Brian Miller, the book is called God's Grandeur, The Catholic Case for Intelligent Design. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
You know, one person who I kept thinking about during the course of this conversation is someone who's no longer with us. I don't talk about this very often. You know the story. But for about a year and a half when I was in college, I actually was a live-in healthcare provider for a quadriplegic man who was a teacher at the University of Cincinnati, Dr. Bob Heeman. And he had had an accident when he was 19 years old. He wanted to be a doctor. He had a lot of doctors in his family. One of his brothers was a doctor. I think maybe one of his other brothers had some sort of medical position. A lot of nieces that were nurses. But when Bob had his accident when he was 19 and he dove into a lake and he broke his neck, he then ended up going on a pathway of the next 30 years of living in a wheelchair. And so he needed help to take care of him. And so I got hired to live in his house and get him dressed and in and out of his wheelchair and take him to his classes every day. But he continued to teach biology. He was a biology professor at the university for all those years until he died. I think he died in like 2000, 2001. But I kept thinking of Bob during these conversations because so many of the things that Dr. Brian was saying reminded me of, I've told you the story of like on our spring breaks, Bob had all of his lectures on slide decks, right? And so he would practice all of his lectures on spring break and then winter break. And I'd come in and out of my room, and Bob would just be sitting there. And even though he was a quadriplegic, he had limited use of his hands, and he could kind of hit the forward and reverse button. And I'd walk into the room, and I just hear him kind of mumbling all these scientific things as he's practicing all of his lectures for the upcoming terms. And I remember even back then living in the house with Bob, just thinking it was kind of interesting that here's a guy who not only is a biologist, but he's someone who had endured a horrific injury and still taught biology. And even though he didn't regularly attend church, he had a faith background with his family. And even though, at that time in my life, I wasn't practicing my faith as fully as I should have. And I, quite honestly, I should have been getting Bob in the van and taking him to church every week, but it just wasn't even something that I was considering. I was 21,
It wasn't on your radar.
It wasn't as much of my radar as it should have been. But I do remember that his family took faith seriously, their Catholic faith seriously, and there was something that was always resonating living in that house and being around scientists and being around someone who had an injury of his level. And never railing against God, I guess, there was always an acceptance even then. So it wasn't as foreign of an idea of accepting, being a scientist and accepting faith. It was more an assumption that you're going to accept faith, that you're going to accept God. There was an assumption that God existed. That was just how it was. And I never once in the time that I lived there ever heard him or any of his other scientific brothers talk in any sort of derogatory way about the faith. On the contrary, it's like one of his siblings had like 10 kids and was sending all of them to Catholic schools and paying for that. So there was always taking that seriously. And I don't know. I kept thinking about that as well as we were talking to Dr. Brian. I kept thinking of Bob. Pray for Bob. May God rest his soul.
I bet my father would have loved
Oh my
this
goodness gracious.
interview, because my father always had what I like to refer to as a childlike wonder for all things science. He was a man of great curiosity of how things worked. He was that guy asking the questions, and he thought nothing of doing the research. So there's always those people in your life. Maybe you're one of them, or maybe you're not. I hope that you got a lot out of this conversation that we had today, because this is the world in which we live. We are products of the mind of God himself. And we have a purpose, and we have, I believe, the right assumption that we're making that, yes, we are part of God's creation, and he intelligently created us and the world in which we live in, and we are all going to return to him. And so I was greatly affirmed by this conversation with Brian Miller today. And I love the gentleness with which he spoke. I mean, like, wow, it would be really awesome to have him as a professor at school to learn about these very big concepts of physics and intelligent design and how the community works, but also philosophy. You can't go very far in science without coming into crossroads with philosophy, because very quickly you get stripped down to those fundamental questions.
Why do you think that?
That's really funny. Because you have to start asking why, why is all of this happening? What is our purpose? And how can we all advance in truth towards the same endpoint of knowing more, but not knowing more for the sake of just knowledge? I mean, that's kind of an empty goal. I mean, to me, the whole point of pursuing knowledge is to know God more, to understand him, of which we profess to love every time we go to Mass. We say we worship, we adore you, we bless you, we praise you, but we need to get to know him and know why he loved us so much that he created us the way that he did, and that how awesome it is to be in this world with this level of design. I never doubted that God did it all. I mean, like evolution, when I was starting to learn about that and in high school, I thought, yeah, but God could have done that. God could have done it all. God could have done the Big Bang Theory. He can do whatever he wants because he's God. And so this is like a no-brainer for me. Like, why are you scientists arguing about this? Like,
you are such
I'm ahead of my time.
Yeah, you're such a daughter of Hector. Let me tell you what. You're just like your dad. Well, folks, thanks for hanging out with us. Thanks to Dr. Brian for being on the program today. We greatly appreciate that. Again, the book is called God's Grandeur, The Catholic Case for Intelligent Design. If you want to dive more deeply into that and have a better understanding of not only the science of things, but philosophy and theology as well, it's a great book that we think that you'll enjoy. And as always, the marching orders is to make sure you pray your rosary every single day.
And do whatever it takes to be holy.
We'll talk to you again in a few days. Till then, God bless, folks.